Hey there everyone, it's Paper Stingray. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Today I'm going to be talking through my process of creating this Grimm Troupe piece from the Hollow Knight series. I just recently finished my first playthrough of Hollow Knight, and I didn't actually come across the Grimm Troupe until pretty late in the game, but I was so excited when I finally found them because I just love anything that has a sort of dark carnival feel to it. I'm working in a 10-inch by 10-inch 300 dpi canvas in Affinity Designer, and compared to my last video, going into this video I knew exactly what I wanted the composition of this piece to look like. I love the way that Grimm will dramatically throw open his cape during the fight, and I knew that I wanted the entire troupe to be posing behind him while he did that, and then I wanted the knight to be in the foreground, being dwarfed by all of them. So to start out, I loaded all my references into my canvas, and I just took off with the sketch process. Interestingly enough, despite knowing how I wanted the piece to be composed, the sketch and the final process both took probably twice as long as any other piece I've done to date. I'm not sure whose bright idea it was to do a piece that involved 5 different characters, but if I find them, I'm gonna really have to give them a piece of my mind. Spoiler alert, it was my bright idea. So, it isn't much of a surprise that my sketch process is as messy and chaotic as it always is, but one thing I really suffered with this piece was the way that everyone was posed in their reference photos was almost exactly how I wanted them to be posed in the actual piece, and it just gave me a feeling like I was just straight copying the original reference. Trust me, I know it sounds crazy to be sitting here crying, "Oh, my reference was too good," but I also didn't want to just copy and paste the original designs into a different format and call it my own. But with that being said, I think I introduced enough variation into the characters and enough originality in the piece itself that that's not really a problem, but I can't help but feel it all over again watching myself sketch it back. If there's one character I feel it's safe to say I maybe didn't do enough with, it'd be the one that I'm sketching in now, Brumm, but sometimes you just have to cut your losses. It is a little bit of a shame, though. Of the story elements of the Grimm Troupe portion of Hollow Knight, his was definitely the most interesting to me. I won't risk getting into any spoilers, but there are 2 different ways that the Grimm Troupe part of Hollow Knight can play out, and I really feel like the game designers did a great job at rewarding the player in a way that matched the route that they decide to take. Finally here, you can see I've finished sketching in the Grimm Child, and I really cannot stress enough how much longer this took than I really expected it to. I take a minute here to sit back and really take in the piece before I start to make any final adjustments. One idea that I had during this process was that I wanted this scene to be taking place inside the tent that the Grimm Troupe shows up in, but since you are inside the tent, where its eyes typically glow red from the outside, I imagine that what you would see from the inside is just the blackness of night. You can also see me take a second there to set up a guide in the center of the piece. Because Grimm and the knight are going to be perfectly centered, I decided I wanted to throw that in there so that I wouldn't have to try to eyeball it. That was never something I was particularly good at. I start to do an iteration sketch here where I go over pieces that I've already done and try to really refine them, but you'll see I give that up pretty quickly because I was pretty happy with how things turned out. Normally, I do a lot of small iterations really quickly, especially if I'm trying to work out a perspective of something that I don't really have the appropriate reference for, but in this case, because my references were so direct, I decided to scrap that process altogether because, for the most part, my original pieces, they were good enough. And finally, I'm on to the vector portion of the piece. Interestingly enough, I've started doing the vector portions on a Twitch stream. It just seemed like something fun to do and I wanted to try it out. And in my first stream, I completed the Knight, the Grimm Child, and Grimm, only to come back for my second stream to finish up the piece and find that I had somehow accidentally deleted all of the work that I did on the first stream. So what you're seeing here is my second attempt. Now, you might think, oh, since you'd already did all these shapes once, you should be ready to do them again much faster this second time around. And you would be wrong in this case. For whatever reason, especially the heads of the Grimm Child and Grimm, I had a terrible time getting those shapes to fit the way that I wanted them to. So, right now I'm working with the body lines on the Grimm child, and this is something you'll see me do several times throughout this piece. I am creating strokes rather than fills, and I am nesting those inside the body curve itself. And an interesting feature of Affinity Designer, and maybe other programs, but I'm not as familiar with them, is that any piece that you nest inside a different curve will only show up in areas where it overlaps with the curve it's being nested inside. So the curve that it's being nested inside is acting like a mask. I like to use this feature a lot for finer details that are part of a larger shape, because I don't have to bother to get the two lines to completely match up. Say, now the edge of Grimm's mask and the edge of his head. I can extend the mask beyond the edge of his head, and then just mask it to his head, and it'll take away the parts that are too far out. For this piece, in my mind, the silver portions of the mask for Grimm and for the Grimm child are an actual mask sitting on the face, while the eyes and the black portion are part of the head itself. So ideally I want them to sit behind the mask. So when I made these black eye holes and then these arching lines that come from the top of the mask to the bottom through the eye holes, I combined those into single shapes using the addition tool, and then I subtracted them out of the silver mask shape, creating what was essentially three separate pieces. There's the left, the center, and the right. And in doing so, when I add the shadows at the end of the piece, the shadows will actually fall onto the area where the mask has been broken apart. As you see me start to build in Brumm's mask, I do the same thing that I did with Grimm and the Grimm child. The only difference is that before I cut out the eye holes and those vertical lines, I made a copy of the original mask shape, turned it black, and then placed it behind the silver mask, so that when those holes were placed in it, there would only be darkness behind it instead of the blue color of his hood. I definitely put off Brumm and Divine till the end because I knew all the little details in the furry, feathery collars that they both have were going to be just a nightmare to add in all those little details. I'm adding in all these shapes pretty haphazardly, and I will pay for that later on when it turns out I have to go back and correct a lot of them. A lot of them will turn out to just be in the wrong order, and they'll need rearranged in my layers. But some of them actually turned out to be facing the wrong direction once the shadows were added. Those ones I had to completely rework because they just didn't make any sense visually. As I'm finishing up Brumm here, one thing I need to reckon with is the fact that I have not figured out a good way to make a visually interesting fire. That's something I'm really going to try to focus on going forward. And last but definitely not least, we've got Divine. She is by far and away my favorite character visually from the Grimm Troupe. I just love the little feather boa they gave her, the half mask, I love the long eyelashes that curve up over the head, and I love the much more haunted look she has on her mask versus the much friendlier look that she has on her exposed face. One thing I wanted to make sure came across visually was that her arms are coming out of her little boa and not simply taped onto the side of it. For her forearm, that definitely came across much more easily than her arm that was in the back of the piece. It's pretty easy to see that because I knew it was going to be behind Grimm's horns, I did not plan that side out nearly as well. Divine also ended up being unique in the way that I designed her mask. Because we could see the face behind her mask, we knew that the eyes and the mouth were not recessed into it, so I left them as though they were just simply stuck on top of the mask itself. Now, as I'm finishing up Divine's face, I'm going to move on to the background of the piece. Since there is so much going on in the foreground of this one, I kept the background about as simple as I possibly could. As I play around with the spotlight that's on the knight, I mess around with a few different layer styles, and I eventually end up going with just the normal layer style, and using a mostly white gradient that fades linearly into transparency on either side of it. I also apply some gradients to Grimm's cape, as well as the fire that Brumm is holding. For the cape, I end up going with a hyperbolic gradient that goes from transparent to black, and I place that over the red layer that's already there. For the fire, I end up using a radial gradient that goes from red to transparent. I also blur the edges of the flame layers using a Gaussian blur, just to kind of soften up that shape a little bit. As I finally start to approach the end of the piece, I'm going to go through and I'm going to select every layer, and I'm going to duplicate it. I may have pointed this out before, but I always like to stress that if you're going to go for this paper layered effect with the shadows, you always want to make sure that you use a duplicate rather than a copy and paste. If you duplicate the layers, a copy of the layer will appear above each individual layer. If you use copy and paste, all the layers will be copied, but they will appear in one big chunk above the ones that you copied, and then you'll need to redistribute them because the shadow for each layer needs to be placed directly underneath it in your layer order. And for my last step, you'll see me go through, I zoom in, and I move to the pixel persona in Affinity Designer. And I select each shadow layer, and I go through with the eraser and erase any part of it that I don't want to show up. Affinity Assistant will immediately make a mask for that layer, and that way when you're erasing, you are hiding anything that you don't want to see. The shape is still there, and the mask can be deleted if you want to, and a couple of times in this I do go back and delete my mask and try again because I ended up erasing a little too much. You'll see I really get into the weeds when I'm dealing with the feather shapes on both Divine and Brumm, but I think that in the end it ended up paying off, and they ended up being pretty interesting looking characters. I fuss around a bit here with the gradient on Grimm's cape just to get it the way that I want it, and then we have the final piece, and I am extremely happy with how this one came out. I really hope that you guys like it too. If you've got any suggestions for characters I could do in the future, please let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, I hope that you'll take a second to subscribe to the channel, and go ahead and hit that like button. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.